Good afternoon, fellow councillors. I'd like to call this meeting to order of December 17, meeting of the Strategic Priorities and Policy Committee. And I would ask for any disclosures of pecuniary interest. Then number 2 on our agenda is the, we have a statement that we typically make at the beginning of our meetings, and please, I will do that now. The City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternative formats and communication supports for council, standing or advisory committee meetings, and information upon request. To make a request for any city service, please contact accessibility@london.ca or 551-661-2489, extension 2425. Thank you very much. May I turn your attention, please, to point 2 of the agenda. Consent. We have future capital budgets impacts. May I have a motion to accept? Michael, Councillor Van Hol, seconded by Councillor Sally. Any comments or questions? Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Your Worship. With respect to the capital budget impacts, I'm not sure if we have a representative from the police here this afternoon or not. Perhaps then for Ms. Barbone. I'm happy to see that police services have put forward the capital budget in there. I remember at the board discussing specifically around the light armored vehicles themselves and having to be identified. As this is put in at 2028 is when those that's aimed to be realized. What would be the process that would be most appropriate for doing that? Is it to actually incur that cost in 2028, or can we reserve against it over the next 10 years to help offset that cost at that time?
Through the chair, there's one of the great things about this is they're trying to give us some advance warning on some of the things that are coming down the pipeline. So from that perspective, it gives us some time to look at some various strategies. So obviously, as part of our 2020 budget and multi-year, we will be looking at the full 10-year plan. And one of the things that I think for the city and all of its boards and commissions that we're looking at is all of the infrastructure renewal and what are some strategies to look at those. So there may be some ways through because it's existing fleet to look at how we're using our infrastructure gap money and allocating that around and looking at a strategy to build up for that over time. So certainly through their infrastructure renewal funding, there are some opportunities that we can look at a longer term strategy to try to mitigate some of that impact in any given year.
Any other comments or questions? Then I'll call the question. All those in favor? Up as we turn your attention to the screen. I'll get this yet.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 15-0.
Thank you. Item 3, scheduled items. We have our first on tabling of the 2019 annual budget update, tax-supported water and wastewater and treatment. I'd like to call Annalise Carbone for a presentation, please.
Good evening. I am pleased tonight to present our final and last update, the 2019 annual update of our 2016 to 2019 multi-year budget. So we have a number of packages that we will be distributing for you, and I believe the councillors already have them, and my staff will be sending them out. So there are 3 packages, 2 that are with respect to the property tax supported budget. One contains our annual update document, and the second, Surlox, contains all of the business cases that support the budget amendments that are before you today. And the third document is our water and wastewater and treatment rate supported budget for 2019 annual update. So while they're finishing distributing these out, I just wanted to take a moment just to recognize my finance staff and all of the work that they've put into putting the documents together that you have before you today. They've worked tirelessly to pull everything together and update all the information on our website so that at the end of this meeting, everything will be available for the public also to review at their leisure. In addition, I also want to recognize all the members of SLT and all of the staff within their service areas who have also contributed to providing budget amendments and updated information that is rolled into what we provide for you today. So I'm going to walk through a bit of the agenda just to give you a high-level update on the multi-year budget process that was approved in 2016 and kind of a refresher of the process that was undertaken, as well as looking at a recap of the multi-year budget and what was been approved within, and then getting into the amendments that we are bringing forward for recommended for you today, as well as in all of the update and amendments contained within the 2019 water and wastewater rate-supported budgets. In addition, we'll walk through how we're going to be informing the public throughout this process, as well as the budget timetable. So just walking through the multi-year budget overview, it all began with Council's strategic plan. So in 2015, the last council approved Council strategic plan, which essentially set the guiding document for how the multi-year budget was going to be developed. So following that process, there was a 4-year average tax levy target that was set that basically formed the foundation that civic administration went back to develop the multi-year budget. And contained within that, there was essentially 2 components. The base budget, which is essentially what it costs to maintain our existing service levels. So that includes all of the inflationary requirements and what it costs to deliver services on a day-to-day basis, as well as some additional component for basically what we have termed our strategic investments, which were newer expanded services based on Council's strategic plan. All of these were brought together and brought forward and approved as part of the 2016 to 2019 multi-year budget. So that was approved at 2.8% as an average across an annual increase across the 4 years. So comprised of that was 2.4%. That was an average annual increase specifically for how to maintain existing services. And the remainder, 0.4%, was specific to an average annual increase to support the new strategic investments that were put forward through the strategic plan. So through that process, the multi-year budget was approved and has set the guiding point for this final place to where we are today. So knowing at the beginning that there would be potentially significant events that might alter the estimates that were already approved within the 4-year plan, we set out 3 specific significant events that would result in a change that would need an annual budget update to our multi-year budget estimates. The first one is a new or changed regulation. A really good example of that is the province's change to the minimum wage, which took place last year and has since been repealed. The second one is a new council direction, so where council may change their direction over the 4 years and may wish to include something different or add, then we have that flexibility to bring that forward, as well as another significant event with respect to cost and or revenue drivers that might require estimates to be modified. So those are all brought forward through the annual update each and every year. So through that process, each year has been an update that has gone forward. And this year, we bring forward the 2019 update, which is scheduled for council approval in February 2019. So after all of these updates, the multi-year budget as a whole is updated, and based on council's final approvals, we go back and update all the business plans that are provided to the public that show how we align to council's strategic plan and multi-year budget. So part of similar but apart are some other processes that are unrelated but related, and they tie into how the multi-year budget works. One of the components is the service review. So within council's strategic plan, or within the multi-year budget from 2016 to 2019, every year there was a target that was included in the budget that civic administration have been tasked to find those savings in each year. And in September of each year, we report out on how civic administration have allocated those savings for transparency. And if they're not met, then that would be an impact on the multi-year budget that would require an update in the following year. Also unrelated but related is the assessment growth policy, which has been delegated through from council to the city treasurer to basically allocate funds from assessment growth revenue to eligible business cases that meet the assessment growth policy. And we report that out in February of each year. And also related to this process is our annual surplus. So we have a policy that has been set out and approved by council, and this is tied to our annual budget monitoring process, and we report out each April of every year following our year-end financial statement confirmation. So tying into that, you see the red line, and you see below the red line is the multi-year budget and kind of gives you the updates that are there. What this shows is how the annual budget monitoring cycle is interspersed and interwoven as part of the multi-year budget. This is one of the reasons that we view the multi-year budget as a strong benefit, is that staff have had additional time to invest into providing additional monitoring activities each and every year. So you'll see the little circle at the bottom, which is where we're at. So we start with the 2019 budget update and confirmation. Later this evening, you'll be having the discussion to begin the discussion on the new strategic plan, which will then set our path forward for the next multi-year budget. So the next milestone will be in April of 2018, when we will report out on our annual update, our annual report on our status of our operating budget monitoring. That'll come from 2018 year to see what our surplus is. We are projecting a surplus at this point in time. So that will then be allocated according to council's policy. And then twice a year, we also provide a mid-year monitoring report. And all of the monitoring reports are comprised of both operating as well as capital. So included in the operating component also provides a detailed update on the status of spending to date on all of council's strategic initiatives, which have been provided to that point in time so that council understands where we are in the process. So to walk you through then in terms of where we're at in the multi-year budget recap. So in year one, in 2016, when council approved the multi-year budget, council approved a 2016 to 2019 average annual increase from rates at 2.8%. So overall, that was 2.4% to maintain existing service levels and an additional 0.4% to fund strategic investments, of which 25 strategic investments were approved, just over $47 million. So you'll see in 2016, the actual annual increase from rates was 2.5%, which had 2.3 related to maintain existing service levels and an additional 0.2 to invest in strategic investments. In 2017, which was our second year of updates, we had roughly a little bit higher to the average that was set and approved by council. We had 20 budget amendments that came forward, and all of them were negligible in terms of the impact on the average increase from rates as approved. So into 2018, we again had a number of budget amendments that were brought forward, and we actually ended up with council approving a marginal tax levy decrease to the rates that were previously approved. And again, we remained at an average increase from rates of 2.8%. So I think just at this point, to give you a little bit of context in terms of London and where the city is in terms of taxation rates across some of comparable municipalities, just to give you some context on the rates that have been approved by council. So BMA Consulting does an annual study every year that does comparators throughout Ontario with a large number of benchmarking activity. And what we've pulled out from that study that was just recently released, just to give you some context, is that looking at the Ontario municipalities that are greater than 100,000 population, just for comparability, and this is across Ontario, you can see the average net municipal levy per capita is approximately $1,500 as an average across. So this is not only ones in our region, but others throughout the province. And if you look at what's actually within our region, we're actually fare even lower along the average, and some of that information is contained. But just to show you across the board, we are at $1,400, which is below the average across Ontario. Also, just to give you some context on this number, what this doesn't do is this just looks at municipal tax levy. It doesn't look and compare what the existing service levels are, what the infrastructure gaps are across the various municipalities. And obviously, those levels of varying taxation are within council's control to vary service levels, which ultimately will have an impact on the net municipal levy. However, just to give you a bit of context also in terms of how this translates into a bit of an ability in terms of affordability and ability to pay, one of the other things I have before you on this graph, and you'll see this is property taxes on the levy as a percentage of household income. And this is, although it's included in the 2018 study, this is actually using 2017 data, so it lags a year behind just because of the timing on which the information is received. So you'll see that the average across Ontario municipalities greater than 100,000 have 3.9%, and the City of London is at 3.6. So we are below the average and in the lower half of all municipalities as well. So just to give you some context. So after the 2018 budget, there was 2019 amendments that were also put forward. So at that time, Council approved an 2019 increase from rates at 3.2%. We had a number of pressures that had come forward that were impacting both 2018 and 2019. So at that time, although Council approved it, Council also directed Civic Administration to bring forward options to reduce the approved 3.2% tax levy and bring it back down to the 2.9% that was originally approved in 2016. So I am pleased tonight to be able to say that not only have we achieved that target, we've come in a little bit lower. So I'm going to turn it over now to Carl Murray, who is our Director of Financial Planning and Business Support, who will walk you through what is contained in our recommendations that are being tabled today.
Okay, so thanks, Annalisa, for that introduction. I'll jump right into the 2019 budget amendment requests. So there are 12 budget amendments before you for this year. 7 of those amendments are operating budget amendments. Of those 7 budget amendments, 3 are reductions, 3 represent budget increases, and 1 does not have an impact on the tax levy. The remaining 5 budget amendments are capital budget amendments, and I'm happy to report that all 5 of those capital budget amendments can be accommodated within the capital plan with no impact on the tax levy. So getting into the specifics of the operating budget amendments, budget amendment number 1 is the amendment to achieve Council's direction to reduce the 2019 tax levy increase from 3.2% to 2.9%. So Civic Administration has gone back and looked at our revenue budgets and done some fine tuning in order to identify approximately $1.1 million of adjustments to bring the tax levy increase down to 2.9% as directed. Budget amendment number 2 relates to the cancellation of the previously approved minimum wage increase for 2019. So the previous provincial government last year mandated that the minimum wage would increase to $14 per hour for 2018 and then to $15 per hour for 2019. However, the new provincial government has since legislated that the minimum wage will remain at $14 per hour for 2019. So this has the effect of reducing our 2019 budget requirement by approximately $521,000. Budget Amendment 3 is a confidential labor relations matter that results in a budget reduction of $2 million. So the first 3 budget amendments are the 3 reductions. Budget Amendment 4 is an increase of $408,000 related to new legislation increasing the requirements for bicycle lane maintenance. So basically increasing the standards associated with bike lane maintenance. Budget Amendment 5 relates to additional resources required by Middlesex London Paramedic Service to address growing call volumes as well as other risk mitigation needs within their organization. I should note that total you see on the screen of a little less than 1.5 million represents the city's share of the increase. And I should also note that Civic Administration is recommending that the portion related to growing call volumes be funded through assessment growth funding in accordance with our assessment growth policy. So the net amount to be funded through tax levy is approximately $590,000. Budget Amendment 6 is from the London Police Service related to an expansion of their safeguard program. So this is essentially extending the mental health supports available to their members throughout the organization. On that one, I should note that the $161,000 request represents 1/2 of the total annual amount, with the balance flowing through the 2020 London Police Service budget. So Budget Amendments 4, 5, and 6 are the increases. Budget Amendment 7 relates to a one-time funding request from the London Children's Museum to provide a municipal contribution to fund their move to a new children's museum at 100 Kellogg Lane. If council chooses to support this budget amendment, Civic Administration recommends that it be funded through a drawdown from the Economic Development Reserve Fund. So if all of the budget amendments recommended are approved, the average annual tax levy increase would decrease from the 2.8% that you saw last year to 2.7%, meaning a $3 average annual reduction for the average property owner. I'll also note that the 2019 increase goes from 3.2% down to 2.7%. So just graphically, our starting point was 3.2% for 2019. Per council direction, we have identified adjustments to bring that down to 2.9%. Budget amendments 2 and 3 bring us down to 2.5%. And then budget amendments 4, 5, and 6 bring us back up to our ending point of 2.7%. At this point, I just wanted to provide a bit of a linkage between budget and tax policy. So, as I've noted, the average annual increase is 2.7%. But having said that, the actual year-over-year tax levy increase for any particular property may end up being more or less than that based on a number of factors. And really only 2 of those factors are under the control of the city. So the council approved budget increase obviously will affect how much a taxpayer pays, as will council approved tax policy. So those are the controllable elements. Oops. Other factors that could affect the tax levy increase include education tax policy, which is a provincial area of responsibility, as well as any changes in the assessed value of the property as determined by the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation. Those are obviously outside of the control of the city. I'd also note that if the assessed value of a property increases more or less than the class average, the increase will change accordingly, and that tax policy is approved separately after budget approval. So maybe the best way to think about the relationship between budget and tax policy is in terms of the analogy of a pie. So budget really deals with how big is the pie, whereas tax policy deals with how is the pie sliced. Forgive my rudimentary graphic design skills. I'd also wanted to point out some things that have been done to mitigate the budget pressures. So we've made strategic use of the operating budget contingency reserve to smooth budget pressures. So included in the 2019 budget, or already baked into the 2019 budget, is a $2 million draw from the operating budget contingency reserve. As you've heard, there are 3 budget amendments that have been submitted resulting in tax levy reductions. We've proposed the use of reserve funds for the Children's Museum's one-time funding request, and that would be the Economic Development Reserve Fund. And we've proposed the use of assessment growth funding in accordance with the city's policy for a portion of the land ambulance budget amendment. As Annalisa previously mentioned as well, the 2016 to 2019 budget does include $4 million of service review reductions that have already been baked in as well. Happy to report that the 2016 target of $500,000 has been achieved. The 2017 target of $1 million has also been achieved, as has the 2018 target of $1.5 million. The 2019 target of $1 million is still in progress. And I'd also point out that while civic service areas represent approximately 46% of the city's total budget, they are absorbing effectively 100% of the service review target. In terms of the 2019 capital budget, it's actually a reduction of approximately $6.2 million. However, there is an increase to the 2020 to 2025 capital plan of approximately $41.4 million. So a net increase in the 10-year capital plan of approximately $35.3 million. Once again, though, all of these capital budget amendments can be accommodated within the capital plan with no tax levy impact. So very quickly, I'll run through what the 5 capital budget amendments are. Number 8 relates to the acceleration of the London Convention Center's roof replacement project. So that results in an increase of approximately $1.9 million for 2019. However, that also results in a reduction of approximately $2.5 million in the 2020 to 2025 forecast period. So an overall net reduction of approximately $632,000. Budget Amendment 9 is a small capital budget amendment related to painting of the Covent Garden Market parking garage. Budget Amendment 10 is also a relatively small capital budget amendment to initiate the study of the Masonville Transit Village secondary plan. And finally, Budget Amendments 11 and 12 relate to updates to cost estimates and timing related to growth transportation projects. The bulk of that $22.6 million increase you see to the 2016 to 2025 capital plan is related to the Warncliffe Road widening project. With respect to the 2019 water budget update, Civic Administration is recommending that the 3% rate increase for 2019 be readopted. That would result in an average ratepayer impact of $11 per year. There are no operating budget amendments recommended for water and only 4 capital budget amendments. 1 amendment for a new environmental assessment, and 3 amendments to project timing. With respect to the 2019 wastewater budget update, Civic Administration also recommends that the 3% rate increase for 2019 be readopted, resulting in average ratepayer impact of $14 per year. There are no wastewater operating budget amendments being proposed, and only 6 capital budget amendments being proposed, 2 increases, 3 deferrals, and 1 deferral with a small increase. So in terms of how we will engage and inform the public throughout the budget process, finance staff will be available to answer questions through email, through phone calls, social media as well. We are available as requested to provide a budget presentation and question and answer with community groups. We'll be utilizing a number of online resources as well, such as the budget calculator and a social media campaign. We have 2 sessions with community groups already scheduled for January, those being the Chamber of Commerce and the Urban League. The public will be able to come out to a budget open house session on January 9th from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. at the BMO Center to speak face-to-face with staff and have their questions answered. And of course, there'll be the opportunity to provide formal input through the public participation meeting at the Strategic Priorities and Policy Committee on January 17th. I've already talked to most of this. However, just note that council budget review is scheduled for SPPC on January 24th and January 28th as required, with final approval of the 2019 annual budget update scheduled for February 12th. So that's all the slides we have. Happy to entertain technical questions.
Are there any questions for either of our presenters? Councillor Morgan.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. My question is on Budget Amendment number 1. Knowing that we're going to have an opportunity to debate and discuss these sorts of things, when I briefly glanced through the document, this was the direction that was given by Council last year because there was a few members of Council who were dissatisfied about going above the 3%, passed a direction to say, what would it look like to stay at 2.9%? And you brought back a series of recommendations. Some of those look like actually reflecting new revenue streams in some of the either changes to the licensing bylaw or simply budgeting differently because of the types of revenue that have been coming in based on parking and tax rates, I think. Some actually are increases to fees. Looks like the tipping fee has an increase, and there was some sort of analysis to right-size that with what's, I guess, generally accepted in the industry. I think it would be valuable for the public discussion for us to be very clear on the breakdown of those. I don't think I need to go through them in detail now, but unless you have some detail on them beyond what's in the budget report, because I think that would be very valuable. So is that going to be part, this is my question, sorry, Your Worship, is that going to be part of the public discussion, a further breakdown of those and maybe separate them into what's a new fee going up and what's simply just us correcting, either legislative changes or being a little more accurate with, estimates and revenues that are coming in?
Through the chair, the business case provides a little bit of detail in terms of the breakdown, in terms of what the changes are. One of the things that we did in terms of looking at our budget monitoring and detailed analysis was to look at ways in which we could recognize, based on our experience, revenue that we weren't already including within the budget. So this reflects some of that analysis in terms of looking at where we could do. There is not a significant amount based on new fees. It's simply looking at what our actual experience has been and where we might be comfortable to be able to be a little bit more aggressive in trying to recognize that up front so that we could capture that with a positive impact to our tax base. So we can provide more detail, certainly through the budget discussions and open house. We're happy to share a little bit more information on what breaks down this if that's required.
Follow-up, Councillor Morgan.
Yes, great, and I appreciate the answer, and I think it's really important to be clear about what is maybe a new fee and how much of it is simply us, basically not having it kick out surplus the other end, but reflecting upfront the expected levels of revenue that are coming in. On page 20, I have one further question, and that will be my last one for now. It was mentioned in the presentation that civic services are absorbing 100% of the service review target costs for 2019 upcoming, but my understanding is that we've offered to the boards and commissions the ability to access things like Lean Six Sigma and that sort of training. Is that not going to be reflected in the budget in any way, or is that's those savings that the boards and commissions, are they reflected in maybe the asks that they're making already in their base budget asks? In other words, I know it says we're absorbing 100%, but I just want to make sure that service being offered is actually landing somewhere and leading to some savings in some way.
Through the chair. So specifically with respect to the targets, those are internal analysis and review that is being done within the city services. We have certainly offered all those other tools to the boards and commissions, and there's been varied uptake throughout. I think where most of the boards and commissions have used that, they are looking for longer term in terms of how they find efficiencies to mitigate future asks that are coming forward. But we have not had any of the boards and commissions come forward and contribute anything at this time. All of that, I hope, will be visible as part of the multi-year budget to satisfy reduced requests that might potentially come forward, but that's at the discretion of the various boards and commissions in terms of what their budgets and some of the targets that we'll set for them through the multi-year budget process. So far, the $3 million that has been found has been internally within the service areas.
Councillor Squire.
Thank you very much. Just one question to you, Mr. Chair. The operating budget contingency reserve, I understand from the documents that $2 million was transferred out of that to cover something. Can you just confirm to me what it was transferred out of there to cover?
Through the chair, so built into our annual budget, there is, it's showing as what you would call a revenue, essentially the same thing as a draw from the reserve fund. So what that does is instead of raising $2 million through the tax levy, that $2 million is coming out of our operating budget contingency reserve to mitigate the tax rate. That was done to smooth out some of the things as part of the multi-year budget initially. So that $2 million draw from the reserve fund is part of the budget and is a revenue mitigating otherwise tax levy that would be required.
Follow-up, Councillor
Yeah, maybe
Squire.
just to be more specific, I remember, and you know, at my age, maybe I'm forgetting, but I thought one of the reasons we did that was because of the increase in the minimum wage. That was something we had not it sort of came up at the last minute. So we said, because this is sort of an extraordinary matter that's happened to us, we're going to transfer money, in this case, out of this reserve fund to cover that extraordinary expense. That was my recollection, that it wasn't a general covering of the budget increase, that we actually used it for that purpose.
Through the chair, this has been part of the annual budget since the initial multi-year budget. There is a $2 million annual draw as part of our built into our multi-year budget. So that has been there each and every year since 2016, and it has fluctuated to various degrees, but the current amount that remains within the budget is $2 million.
Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to thank staff for the presentation. I really appreciated the update and the overview. Got two quick questions about informing the public and how we're going to do that. First of all, the budget calculator, is that on the website now? And if not, when will it be there?
Through the chair, it is on the website and will be there available for the public at the end of this meeting.
Terrific, because I think it's a great calculator and the public can go in and just decide what they want to pull in or put it into the budget and find out what the final result would be. So I would definitely encourage the public to do that. My second question, if I may ask, is the public participation meeting on January the 17th. Given that it is December the 17th, we've got 1 month, and just with the holiday season upon us, I'm just wondering what the process is going to be informing the public on the public participation meeting.
Through the chair, my understanding is that notification to the public has already gone out of all of the deadlines to provide written submissions, as well as information on those sessions has already gone out this past weekend. So it is out there and will continue to be communicated up until that time.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. The joint water boards reduced their annual rate increase from 3% down to 2% this year, but I noticed that none of that savings was passed along to the ratepayers in this. I'm wondering if you'd comment on that.
Through the chair, although there was a reduction to 2% for one of the boards, the other board actually had an increase of 4%. So the net impact at the end of the day of the two water boards was only $30,000 approximately. So it was negligible and not enough to reduce the rates.
Not by 10 cents each. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to staff, I really appreciate the presentation, so thank you very much, and thanks for this information. I particularly like page 18 on the printed version of your slides, where you're linking the budget to tax policy. And I think that's what's really important to the general public out there, to the average homeowner. would really like to see, what the bottom line is for them. And I know that we do this 2.8% average across the board, and that's about the pie. But when we talk about slicing up the pie, we see the difference in a residential tax levy increase compared to the commercial and industrial. And I wonder if we could perhaps have an extra slide going forward, or a couple of extra slides, where we actually show what the effect is to homeowners based on how we slice up the pie. And also in particular, a comparison, I like your comparison slides to other municipalities, but if we can do a comparison to other municipalities based on the residential rate and not the entire levy lumped all in together.
Ms. Murray or Mr. Murray or Ms. Barbone?
Through the chair, so we can provide you what the 2018 rates were, because that was based on the last year's former. The tax policy for 2019 will be set generally in March and April. We try to get it done early April if possible, but because it is contingent on when the province provides us with the education tax rates to finalize, that's why it's a little bit more delayed and we can't do it at this time. But to provide you, I have the rates for the 2018 budget increase for the average annual was 2.8 for 2018. After the tax policy approval, the residential rate was 2%. The multi-residential rate was equalized to be at 2%. The commercial rate was a little bit higher at 5.8, and the industrial was at 2.1. So that's how the pie was sliced. So it'll be up to Council's decision on the tax policy for 2019 to determine what that will be for 2019's budget.
Follow-up?
Yeah, one quick follow-up. And so for the commercial and industrial rate, I don't expect you to have this off the top of your head, but if you have a rough idea of how London compares for our commercial industrial rate to other municipalities, and I'll try to stop hitting my microphone.
Through the chair, that is included in the BMA study and is information that was just recently published, so we can certainly provide that in January as part of the deliberations, if that would be helpful.
Thank you. Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thanks to staff for all the work that goes into this. I know this is months and months, if not the whole year, getting ready just for this day. I have two questions. One with respect to the public meeting at BMO in January. I think you and I had probably discussed earlier about the opportunity to kind of do that, like the Services London open house that we've had before, where each of the service divisions so within the city present or provide opportunities to have discussions about what they do. Linking that with the budget would be so powerful to be able to have, this is what the cut of the pie is associated with this service area, and what the strategic investments and what the budget implications are with respect to those areas. If those can be done in concert, I think it really help to illustrate how the budget works and how it directly impacts the services that Londoners receive. I'm
sorry, was there a question or that was a comment?
There is a question right now. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Stand by. So the question that I have, though, is with respect to the use of one-time funds, and that is outlined with respect to surplus, contingency funds, assessment growth. In certain circumstances, what we have done in the past, the $2 million that Councillor Squire was just talking about, I was pretty sure, as we discussed the last time, that where we used one-time funding, it was for one-time costs. I just want to have some comfort that we're not looking at continuing use of one-time funding for ongoing costs, and that we're allocating the appropriate revenue sources against ongoing versus one-time.
So through the chair, the existing $2 million that is currently in the budget, we have been trying to decrease over time. So because it has an impact on the tax levy, that's something that we haven't done all at once. And so originally, I think this is what Councillor Squire was referring to, was it was a little bit higher, and we're at $2 million for 2019. So that is definitely something that we've taken a very measured approach over number of years to try to get down to a lower level so that we have sustainable funding in that contingency reserve fund going forward.
Follow? You're good? Any other questions for our presenters? Councillor Helmer.
Thank you, and through the chair, just to briefly about amendment number 7, this is the Children's Museum funding request. I know it's recommended that it be the Economic Development Reserve Fund. I wonder, we do now have the Tourism Infrastructure Reserve Fund, and it seems like something that's pretty well aligned with that, whether that's also going to be considered. I know it's new, and the balance of the fund is not very high right now, but I just wonder if we look at that as a potential source of funding.
Through the chair, that would be something that could be considered. Obviously, because it's new at this time, I think because of the changes, we kind of looked, there is a bit of an economic development part to this. There is a piece that's tourism as well. Certainly because we don't have that much in the reserve fund yet is why we're not looking at that source. If the request had been a year down the road, we probably would have recommended that, but the balance just isn't there yet. So we feel the Economic Development Reserve Fund is reasonable and fits. However, if Council wanted to go that other route, we would just have to wait for the money to accumulate to have some certainty that it was there first.
Any other questions for our presenters? Councillor Morgan.
Yes, seeing there are no other questions, I'd like to move that the following actions be taken with respect to the 2019 annual update of the 2016 to 2019 multi-year budget, that the attached overview presentation from the Managing Director of Corporate Services and City Treasurer, Chief Financial Officer, and Director of Financial Planning and Business Support be received, and the draft tax-supported operating capital, water, wastewater treatment budgets, as well as the related budget business cases be referred to the 2019 annual update process for the 2016 to 2019 multi-year budget.
Well, that's a mouthful. Is there a seconder? Councillor Turner. Any final comments, questions? Then I'll turn your attention to the screen.
Councillor Van Meerbergen. Closing the vote, the motion carries 15-0.
Thanks very much, Ms. Barbone. Mr. Murray, thank you very much. I think that was a very helpful presentation. More to follow. Now 3.2, Council Strategic Plan 2019-2023. Setting the context. We'd like to call up Lynn Livingston, please.
Well, Your Worship, and through the chair, we're excited to bring this work to you. It's work that you're going to be doing, so that's why we're excited. No. It's basically, this is Council's plan, and this is the guiding document. It's going to lead our organization. It's going to set the direction and expectations for our work over the next 4 years. It gets reflected in the multi-year budget, as you just heard, and it cascades all the way down to individual performance plans for employees. What it does is it drives the organization and it ensures that we're delivering on Council's direction, and ensures that our work is focused, that we're doing the right things, and that we're accountable for what we do. So what we have in front of you today is a draft process for you to consider, and that really incorporates some of the key learnings that we've gone through over the last cycle. So we got longer time for debates, we got increased focus, deeper engagement. We've in the process of developing measures for the strategies, and hopefully you'll see that in the approach that's before you. We're here to support you in the development of your plan, and I'm going to throw it over right now to Ms. Livingston to walk you through a presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Hayward, and I do have a very brief presentation merely to highlight some of the components that were outlined in the report that's part of your agenda. As Mr. Hayward's indicated, Council's strategic plan is quite a significant document for the corporation. It articulates Council's vision, mission, values, and strategic areas of focus or priorities over the next 4 years. It will lay out what outcomes and expected results you expect to see over that time frame, as well as the strategies that Council and Civic Administration would deliver on together. And quite importantly, it sets the direction for the multi-year budget, as Ms. Barbone mentioned. In particular, what the multi-year budget does is address the resourcing and pacing of the delivery of the strategic plan. In order to identify a process to support you in this work, we looked at the process that was used for the last strategic plan and sought feedback from Council, from the agencies, boards, and commissions, as well as staff that were involved, and had some learnings that we wanted to reflect in the proposed new process. One of the most important learnings was that the timeline last time was considered to be too aggressive, that Council wished to have more time for debate with each other, as well as engagement with the community on that plan. That there should be measures at the beginning of the plan, being clear about the outcomes and expected results that Council wished to see over the period of time, but that we did have a strong plan to build from, so not to start entirely from scratch, to build from that plan, to build on the broad engagement that was used to establish the last plan, but deepen that, and again, have that very intentional link with the budget. And we're also trying to achieve this balance of being comprehensive. It's an organization with over 100 services, but also be very focused in what the plan should be looking at. And of course, we would like it to be easy to read. So given those learnings, the approach that we're proposing for your consideration is that the strategic plan continue to be seen as a directional document, and that we build from the last strategic plan. There are a number of strategies in that plan that carry forward on the time horizon, and they form a basis of what the next plan can look like. So this just gives you a sense of the multitude of different documents and strategies that were already in place. And again, this strategic plan would cover that 4-year period of what you wish to achieve through that work. The other piece we would propose is that there be we had a great connection with the last multi-year budget, but we would be much more intentional this time in terms of the strategies and business plans would reflect the same language and metrics. So we're much more tightly connected in terms of the strat plan driving into what we should deliver on through the multi-year budget. We would also propose that it be very focused around the strategic actions, so quite clear about what needs to be achieved over that 4-year period. And part of what helps with that is establishing at the very beginning measurable outcomes and expected results. So it's clearly understood what Council wishes to achieve. And with that, we would propose the following approach, which was articulated in the report in your agenda. So driving from the top down, Council establishes the vision, mission, and values for the corporation, identifies those strategic areas of focus or priority areas of focus, if you will, and then the outcomes, which are what are the intended areas of change that you wish to see happen, and what does that exactly look like? Those are the expected results. The strategies are the very specific actions that deliver on those expected results and outcomes. So that's the structure of the plan that we would suggest. So essentially a top-down, bottom-up approach to arriving at a strategic plan. The timeline for that, working with the notion of having a bit more time for debate amongst yourselves and engagement with the community, we would propose that January be dedicated to discussions of the vision, mission, and values, and a tabling of the outcomes and strategic actions. Community engagement engagement would begin right away, hearing from the community and what they think about. Council should be setting for the vision, and that would carry through to the end of February. March would be time dedicated for council to debate the outcomes, expected results, and strategies. Those would be tabled at the end of January. You would hear from the community in February and then have an opportunity to debate those amongst yourselves. And then finally, working into April to complete your debate around the plan. April 30th is the targeted timeline for completion of the strategic plan. That's about as late as you could go in terms of being able to provide very clear direction for the development of the multi-year budget. In terms of a proposed community engagement approach, as I indicated, we would suggest that would begin immediately through getinvolvedlondon.ca, where council would be able to hear some feedback on the vision, mission, and values, and that would carry through into January. February would be dedicated to a much broader and deeper engagement, both online and in person, again about where council's arrived at by the end of January on the vision, mission, and values, but also early feedback on the outcomes, expected results, and strategies. Additionally, our report provided to you some background material just to help set some context and help you in your thinking as you consider the strategic plan, and they're just listed there for your information. So with that, I'll close, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Any questions for Mr. Hayward and Ms. Livingston? Councillor Squire.
One of the things, being a huge, someone who likes to see not just outcomes, but also economic impacts, financial impacts of plans that a council may derive, my first question is, when we come up with something in the strategic plan, will there be some information provided to say, this is a wonderful idea, but it's going to cost way more money than is reasonable to do something like this? Because I don't remember that happening last time.
Through the chair, we actually have a fairly detailed, what we call strategy development tool. So for every single strategy that is under consideration, we are articulating the magnitude of the budget as well as the metrics that would be considered. So council will have that information as you debate the strategies.
Follow-up. One of the wonderful things I noticed happening is when I voted for the strategic plan last time, it was a large document, a lot of things in it. And then for the next 4 years, I heard some of my colleagues get up and say, well, we voted for the strategic plan unanimously, so we should all be supporting this particular initiative. So this may be slightly a political question, but maybe you can help me. What if there's 4 or 5 things in this big strategic plan that I absolutely oppose, my constituents oppose, but I want to support the idea of a strategic plan? Can I vote against the whole plan and feel good about that?
That's your choice. And that's a political answer.
I'll come back if we need to. Think about that, please. Councillor Van Holst, please.
Thank you very much. And through you to our staff, excellent to hear we're talking about metrics for the various things. And I'm wondering if you might tell us some of the new metrics you might consider including in this process.
Through your worship, we're in very early stages of developing those, councillors, so I'm not really in a position to talk about it. What I can tell you, though, is we are focused very much from an outcome perspective. So if an outcome were that we wanted to see increased safety in our community, the expected results would be aligned with that. So we would have metrics that might deal with safety type metrics, so crime, residential fires, those kinds of things. So we're trying to be quite intentional of connecting what the outcome is to an expected result and having very clear measures at the very beginning of the process this time.
Thank you, Councillor Van Holst. Before I turn to the next question, I'll give the opportunity to Councillor Squire if he has a follow-up to the follow-up that's not overly political.
No, I mean, the question I asked was a question politically that I didn't care what the answer was to it, and Mr. Hayward's really picked up on that and provided me with the appropriate answer.
Brevity is the soul of it, Mr. Squire. Mr. Turner, thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you. So with respect to, I'd imagine through the public consultations, we'll have a lot of input. There might be some areas that weren't covered in the areas that you heard from Council-elect at the time. One of the areas that I'd noticed that doesn't get mentioned is culture, for example. Culture. Yeah, so those might be things that come up through the discussion, and I'd imagine there are those opportunities to add or augment as required.
Through your worship, I think you can anticipate, so the background materials were a piece of information. I think you can anticipate when we table for your consideration the outcomes, expected results, and strategies, having a much more comprehensive approach to it.
Thank you. Councillor Morgan.
Yes, through you, your worship. One of the challenges I think we had with the previous strategic plan is that it had a very strong link to the multi-year budget, and we're looking to improve that. That meant it was very detailed. I think one of the criticisms we faced then with our strategic plan is that no one thought it was strategic because it had 100 some odd plus items in it. And so I wonder are we working towards having a strategic direction and then an operational plan to say this is the type of commitment that councils make to work on these projects in these ways with these measures with the community? And do we want to be cautious with the language? I wonder if this came up through any of your discussions or investigations for the last plan, because I think it's really important to be clear with the community where we're setting strategic directions, but also on the other hand, have a document that allows us to tie it from an operational perspective to the budget, but it might not be everything in that is strategic by the definition of the word.
Through your worship, so what we heard clearly is the need to raise the level of strategies to a higher level so that they're much more directional in this plan. However, in order to, sorry, I can't see you, Councillor. In order to be able to understand the order of magnitude cost and the metrics and the pacing, civic administration needs to take that work down a bit. So the question is what winds up in the actual strategic plan final document and what is perhaps in a more implementation plan, if you will. And then of course the multi-year budget really sets the resourcing and pacing. So it's documents that work together. You may recall that in the last round, the implementation plan, if you will, was the milestone document, those 1,000 that we reported on quite regularly. So it is a separate document, and then that also interrelates with the multi-year budget. So a shorter answer to your question is the strategies will be at a higher level, but we will have the detail behind them to understand the costing and the metrics and the pacing.
Follow-up?
And I absolutely, through you, your worship, appreciate that, because I want us to be very specific, because I want people to be able to dig down into the details to say, you're doing this, you're measuring it this way, this is how you hope to achieve it, this is what you expect it to cost. But at the same time, I do want us to be careful with the way that we set up and give the strategic component of the plan to the public. And I think certainly it sounds like we're on that, and I'll be kind of looking for that through the process to see how we can do that to be, both very clear with our strategic direction, but also very practical in the execution of what we're going to do as a council over the next 4 years.
Noted. Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you to staff. First of all, thank you for the presentation and the report. It was very helpful. Obviously, this is a starting point for us to get us thinking, but I did have a question for you specifically in reference to Appendix number 2. And I appreciate very much staff meeting with the councillors-elect before we came formally into this chamber and to listen to what we heard through our public engagement process over, well, about 6 months from May until October 22nd. My question specifically is really around the breakdown of these things. I certainly, when I raised, for example, congestion and coordination of road work, that to me is part of transportation. Things like transit BRT don't exist in isolation. They exist as part of our road system. Similarly, when I talked about things like road safety in neighborhoods, traffic calming around our schools, that to me is part of the neighborhood services and engagement. So I'm just wondering what was the rationale behind this detailed breakdown? Because the appendix indicates that these are beginning with the most commonly mentioned themes and then listed in descending order. But some of these to me, I feel are actually higher up on the list because they were in a broader category than they came out in the report. So if you could just comment on the the thought process behind the categorization?
Through your worship, we just try to provide themes. So what you see is the first category of transportation, those were what we heard most often. The congestion in traffic, while I would readily agree with you are a component of transportation, were heard less often than those. I fully accept that you could group these differently, so it's not meant to be finite or a science. It was really just to highlight various themes that came out through the discussions. The same with the community safety. Happily agree with you that it is part of neighborhood. It's just how often we heard it, and you could certainly collapse those things if you wish. It was just an effort to reflect back some themes around what we heard from you.
Any other questions from members around the table? I have one, and that is as a follow-up to Councillor Lewis, and that is the reference that I read with regard to getting input from a number of councillors. I guess the question I might have, and perhaps it's more around the table than at you, is whether members of council felt that input was sufficiently received, and perhaps I might ask you, Ms. Livingston, if you felt you did a sufficient and broadband or broad depth input from all councillors, or was it just select?
Through your worship, what the list reflects is the themes that we heard from the councillors that chose to engage in the dialogue. And so not every councillor participated, which is certainly fine. This was a piece of information. We then, so I took detailed notes. One of my team transcribed those notes and did a theming analysis, and that's what you see in front of you. And I just want to reiterate that it is an important piece of information, but a piece of information, and all of you will have known what you heard from your constituents over the last number of months.
Thank you. Any other final questions? Councillor Squire.
No. Oh, I'm going to.
Councillor Squire, were you going to read it, or did you just presume we all did?
I presume we all did. It's very short. Just receive.
Just to yeah. Any questions about the motion on the floor?
Just receiving it.
Exactly. Just receiving. Is there a seconder? Councillor Hopkins, may I turn your attention to the screen, please?
Closing the vote, the motion carries 15-0.
Thank you very much. Item 4, items for direction. We have the 4.1, the 2019 development charges study and the update on the draft rates. We're asking Paul Yeoman, please, to make a presentation. Sir, to you.
Well, thank you very much, Your Worship. It's a pleasure to be with you all tonight to talk about one of my favorite municipal topics, and that's development charges. We have a pretty comprehensive presentation for you. I'm going to try to keep it as brief as I can. We do have two reports, though, that are on the agenda for tonight. One is an update on our draft DC rates and where we're at in the process to date. I should mention that this isn't the draft background study or the bylaw that's before you tonight. That's coming to you in March, so we still have quite a bit of work to do to get there. We also have a policy review and the outcomes of that regarding non-residential rates that I'm going to be speaking about. But I'm going to be starting, as I mentioned, with the presentation, just to give you a high-level overview of an introduction to development charges. This really is a major corporate initiative that Council is going to be involved with for the first half of 2019. I really want to start, though, by thanking and recognizing our stakeholders that are here tonight. Many of them have requested to speak to you tonight as well. I think that they would really add a lot of value to the conversation. They've been an integral part of the development charges review process. And I also have my development charges team with me tonight. I've got Jason Sinise and Kevin Edwards, great members of our administration. So as I mentioned, I'm just going to give you a general update and some information, a framework of DC matters. I'm going to talk to you about the 29 DC study, where we've been and where we're going as we move forward. I'm going to get into the report recommendations that are before you that are an update on our rates and our non-residential rate review, and then I'm going to finish with some key takeaways for you as well. The first thing I'm going to begin with, though, is a video that was prepared by our finance team. This is publicly available on the city's website. I think it provides a really good primer to DCs, and so I'm just going to play that for you now and then continue on from there. Technical difficulties, my apologies.
Development charges are a fee charged by the municipality for the recovery of growth costs. Growth costs are recovered to build new infrastructure supporting growth, to pay down existing debt for past growth works, and to avoid taxpayers paying for costs that serve growth. Development charges do not pay for operating costs or infrastructure renewal. That's paid for by new taxes from new homes and businesses, also known as assessment growth. Development charges must be paid when a building permit is issued for most new buildings. Development charges would be charged for new buildings, expanded buildings, and converted buildings, and are split into different groups and classifications. Let's look at a hypothetical example of a subdivision development and development charges in action. We will get to know how development charges are calculated in a moment. In order for this area to undergo development, it will need a stormwater management facility, major water mains, sanitary sewers and sewer pipes, also known as trunks. With these major services now available, the developer of the land can undertake the planning needed to lay out street patterns and other servicing needs. These other services required are paid for by the developer and not development charges. Building of new homes or commercial enterprises can begin. Over several years, the subdivision is populated, built out, and may require a district park and community center. These items would be partially funded by development charges. It's now time to look at how development charge rates are calculated, which can be the most complicated item. But first, it's important to know that all municipalities in Ontario must follow the Development Charges Act, which outlines rules municipalities must follow for setting a development charge rate. The main focus of development charge calculation is recovering the appropriate amount of money from individuals who are sparking city growth. In simple terms, the rate is calculated as follows. The total dollar value of major growth projects, which is made up of the number of major growth projects, timing of projects, and post-period benefit, as well as other factors. This is then divided by the projected growth to be sparked by projects, which is made up of the amount of forecasted units in space and splits by development type. Okay, let's recap what we have learned. 1. Development charges are fees collected by a municipality for the recovery of growth costs. 2. Development charges are governed by the Province of Ontario under the Development Charges Act. 3. Development charges only pay for the initial capital cost of major growth-related services that have been identified as part of the rate-setting process. 4. Development charges are paid by individuals or entities looking to construct new buildings, expand buildings, or convert buildings for a different use. 5. Development charge rate calculations are based on the formula of total dollar value of major growth projects divided by the projected growth to be sparked by those projects. And that explains how your city uses development charges to pay for growth.
So 4 minutes on development charges, I think that's a pretty impressive feat. As the video mentioned, there are really, the development charges are governed by the DC Act, and there's four major components of that I've highlighted for you here tonight. The first is really recognizing that DCs are paying for increased capital costs for new development. So really DCs are about cost recovery for new growth. It's an important thing to remember. Section 5 really articulates the methodology on how DCs are determined. This is consistent throughout the province, and the rules are articulated in the Act. There's a key disclaimer here, though, which is that bullet that's before you. The DCs for a particular, DCs that are related for a particular development do not necessarily relate to the infrastructure costs for that development, which I think is an important thing to keep in mind and to remember. DCs really are modeled at a high level, so we don't get into the fine grain of what an actual individual development requires. Section 9 states that the DC bylaw expires every 5 years, and that's why we're here before you. Our DC bylaw expires in August 2019. And Section 33 really does articulate that DCs are to be included into separate reserve funds, and the costs for growth are only to be paid for from those individual reserve funds. That's for management and transparency, which is really important. The next key point is who pays for DCs and where does the money go. So as you can see here, residential development pays DCs, so all new home buyers pay development charges for the homes that they avail of. Businesses pay development charges for commercial. Industrial does not pay development charges in the City of London. We actually fund industrial development through our community improvement plan, so taxpayer contributions pay for that development charge. And then for institutional, we have a 50% discount for qualifying institutional buildings. The city does pay for that as well. So the money then is collected. It goes into these individual reserve funds for the portions, the components of the DCs that are collected. Moving on then to the 2019 DC study. So there are three key elements to a DC rate setting process. The first is starting with policy decisions. You then move into a background study, and then you have rate calculations that are the end result. All of these really involve, as I mentioned, extensive stakeholder engagement. It's really important that we have the Urban League at the table, the Home Builders Association, the London Development Institute as well. I really want to thank those stakeholders for the time and dedication they've put in. We have some great conversations at our stakeholder meetings that really drive the recommendations that come before you. Starting with policy decisions, we look at a number of different things, and really this has to deal with who pays development charges and then qualifying infrastructure and services. I'm not going to go into these in detail. Many of the policy decisions that you see articulated here were matters that were considered by the previous council. They'll be before you with the end development charges background study and bylaw. There are two key outstanding ones. The first is the non-residential rate review, which I'll be speaking more about. The second is the new DC rate components that are included in your report as well. This is something that council will be considering when the actual draft background study is tabled in the bylaw as well for inclusion in the future. The background study involves extensive stakeholder consultation, adherence to the Development Charges Act and the provisions there. We engage our partners both internally for staff and also our agency boards and commissions that have rate components that we're recovering for as well. We have an internal steering committee that adheres and works through the Development Charges background study. We engage a number of consultants as we work through things too. So really this is when we get into the detailed technical review of the information to drive the end rates that come before you. As I mentioned, Section 5 of the Act is what's really key in terms of determining the end costs that come before you. So for a background study, the first thing we're doing is we're looking at citywide growth. So we have a growth projections consultant that actually does a growth forecast for the city for 20 years. We then take that information, we do a build-out scenario for the city as to where we anticipate that growth occurring. And we provide that information then to our service partners. So they do a bunch of modeling for project information. They get information on the project requirements and the project timing associated with that growth that needs to be recovered for. From there, they're then calculating project cost estimates for those. So they're looking at past experience and tenders to determine project costs, comparison with other municipalities and what they're seeing. And also we build in contingencies to make sure that we can afford our infrastructure plan as we go forward. So once we get that gross DC cost for all of the individual projects, the Act does require a number of deductions or matters that are considered when we go through our rate calculations. And you can see them above you here. The first is that we're looking at previous funding from past budgets, so making sure that we're netting that off. If there are provincial or federal grants that are applicable to a certain project, we're making a deduction for that. We also recognize what we term future benefits. So that is portions of the project that service growth beyond the recovery period that we're going to collect for in the future. We're also deducting what we term the non-growth share, so that's infrastructure components and the cost that's ascribed to the existing development on the ground at the time the project is constructed. We also then will make a deduction per the Act for a 10% statutory deduction. So this is things like parks, libraries, and growth studies. And then finally, for certain services, we have a service standard limitation. So we're looking at the last 10 years in terms of what we constructed to determine a maximum recovery amount that we can't recover beyond. From there, we get to the net DC recoverable. So we have certain elements that are related to hard services, which are generally roads, stormwater ponds, sanitary sewers, things like that. And all the others apply to the soft services, so parks and recreation, growth studies, libraries, those services as well. So the final output from our DC background study information is the actual rate calculations. The video got into this a little bit, but I think it's important to highlight again. At a very high level, what we're doing is we're combining the total net project cost for all the projects, and we're dividing that by the amount of growth. So that's population growth for residential, and it's also space for non-residential. All of that's informed by a number of factors. For the net project costs, we're looking at the number of projects. That informs the scope of our DC recovery. For the timing of projects, that impacts the cash flow in terms of when we actually need the money to spend on the various projects. And then there's the deductions that I mentioned as well, and those are paid by and large by other sources. For the growth, we're looking at the splits by type of development, so that's how we carve off the recovery for who's paying what. And then also we're looking at the amount of forecasted units in space, which is really the growth triggering projects as well, which gives us the DC rates. Through a DC background study, we really are doing a bit of a balancing act here. We're looking at things like maximizing new opportunities for growth throughout the city. We're also mindful of concerns that are raised about additional cost to home buyers and businesses. We're wanting to ensure that we have sufficient recovery for the capital plan. As I mentioned, DCs are about cost recovery and making sure that we can afford to pay for the city's infrastructure plan as we go forward. And then finally, as articulated in both of our official plans, growth should pay for growth for infrastructure costs that benefit growth. So the first report before you is the draft DCs. I've highlighted here the single family rate, the draft calculated rate as of today. You can see the index rate, what the DCs will be January 1st, 2019, that's $32,011. What I should highlight as well for you is that the current DC rate right now for a single family home is $30,435. Each year we index the DC rates to make sure we're keeping up with inflationary pressures. So the current rate in relation to the index rate, it's already a 5% increase, 5.2% increase on rates. The August draft calculated rate would add an additional 2.2% for our DC rates. As I mentioned, you can see the additional rate components that are identified as well. These are something for council to consider when the background study is before them too. We've also provided some comparison information in the report for large urban municipalities are like similar municipalities. What you're seeing here is that London generally compares quite favorably in relation to the other municipalities. We've also provided a bit of an apples-to-apples comparison here. So municipalities each control what they include as rate components within their charge. And so the black portion of the bars that you're seeing there is what we term the base rate. So that's what's comparable amongst the various municipalities. The light-colored portion is stormwater management. So the City of London actually includes stormwater management as a component in their charge. A number of other municipalities either have it as a local service, so that's directly provided by the developer, or it's actually on a per hectare basis, so it's difficult to provide that one-to-one comparison as we go forward. We also provide local municipalities, so the areas surrounding London. We are, of course, the largest municipality in our area, and we have the largest total DC as a result. But again, what we're providing is the apples-to-apples comparison here. We have our base DC. We also, of course, have a large number of road projects. Roads really are the major driver of our DCs. The local municipalities around us have a relatively minor roads component. They don't experience the same growth pressures we do. And also the County of Middlesex provides regional roads, and they don't actually charge a development charge. And also I've articulated stormwater management separately here too. Stormwater management is generally a local service in these municipalities as well. So in terms of the non-residential DC rate review, we have a recommendation before you. We have concluded this policy review. The two key drivers for it were concerns that have been raised to us at the end of our last DC study about our commercial DC rate. You may be aware that Council's actually been phasing in its commercial rate. That was subsidized by taxpayer contributions over a 4-year period. And also concerns have been expressed to us about non-residential conversions as well. So these are two things that we're looking at ways to address. There's a number of options that you can see here that we looked at, including retaining the status quo, which is our 3 separate rates. We looked at a blended DC rate, so this would be a single non-residential rate. We looked at an industrial or non-industrial rate, so that would be related to your incentive and non-incentivized non-residential uses. And then finally, we looked at an option where we look at our current rate structure, so separate industrial, commercial, and institutional rates, and then a bylaw approach for conversions. And that's actually what we're recommending before you tonight. The key factor here is that if you're doing a one-to-one space conversion, so if you're taking an existing industrial building, converting that similar space into commercial, you wouldn't actually pay DCs on that, as long as, and this is the key factor, as the industrial building was over 10 years. So this really does protect the city's investment that was made in the incentive programs for the industrial buildings. I think it's also important to note that we aren't recommending anything related to the commercial rate tonight. Our calculated commercial rate, as described in the first report before you, is actually lower than the current DC rate that we have, and there's also not a source of funding for a commercial rate phase-in. So in terms of the conversion approach, I put together a bit of an illustration here to try to help better understand what we're talking about. So the blue box represents an existing industrial building that's being converted to commercial. So you're taking 1,000 square meters of industrial space, converting that same 1,000 square meters to commercial space, and also the proponent is adding on 150 square meters of new commercial space as well. Under the current approach, we have our two different industrial and commercial rates. So what we would do is we would say, okay, well, what would that commercial building be if it was built new? We'd do a calculation based on that. We'd then credit the industrial space from that as well. And we'd then add on the new residential or new commercial space that was added, and you'd have a net DC of $145,000 for this particular project. Under the new approach, the industrial space is being converted to commercial space. It's a one-to-one conversion. There's no change there. So the proponent is actually only paying on the additional space that's being created. So the DCs that would be applicable for this project would be $45,000. So we do have a lot of work to undertake in the coming months. We're also continuing our dialogue with stakeholders. This is the high-level timeline for Council's benefit. The first key element is that we're releasing the DC background study and bylaw to the public on February the 25th. We will then have a PPM and recommendations before you, tabling a report on March the 25th. May the 6th will then have council deliberation, this committee deliberation on the draft bylaw and background study. And we're targeting right now May the 7th for council approval of the DC bylaw and the background study, which would be well in advance of the August the 4th expiration date. So just to wrap up and summarize, a couple key points here to remember. DCs really are paying for new infrastructure projects and past investments and growth throughout the city. DCs are paying for the initial capital costs. They're not paying for local services that are paid for by developers. They're not paying for ongoing operating costs, which are paid by taxpayers and ratepayers, or life cycle renewal costs as well. DCs are determined through a legislated process. It's quite an involved process that we adhere to as we go forward. And we do have extensive stakeholder consultation, which really does add a lot of value to the DC rate setting process. So with that, I'll conclude. We also have a handout for you as well that we've provided. Just gives you a high-level overview of the draft DC study and some other information. We're also intending to do a web page as well to collect public feedback as we go forward. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Paul. Any questions for Mr. Yeoman? Josh Morgan. Councillor Morgan.
Yes, Your Worship. Would you like questions on both 4.1 and 4.2, or would you like to deal with those separately?
I'd like to do that. We'll stay with 4.1 for this purpose, please.
Okay, I'll have a question on both. So for 4.1, the only question I have is for Mr. Yeoman through you, is the growth-related projections that we do. We have a demographic consultant. We kind of project this out. What sort of analysis do we do on how accurate those things have been in the past to inform the future? I mean, like we've obviously projected forward and then found out, did it work out or not? And what sort of corrections are made based on what we learned from that?
Through the chair, so the demographics consultant that we hired was Watson and Associates. They're provincially renowned for doing this kind of work. What we do to ground truth the assumptions as we go forward beyond the DC process is you have your annual GMIS update. That's your growth management implementation strategy. We do a pretty comprehensive analysis of growth and development in the city to really ground truth whether those assumptions are proving out, and then whether or not adjustments are needed to your capital program to either accelerate projects if growth is taking off more than the projections would demonstrate, or if growth is slowing back, then we'll defer projects and make recommendations to you on that as well.
Follow?
Yes, and I realize that process. In fact, I quite like it because you get the big maps and everything. It's a lot of fun for those of us who like this sort of thing. What I was asking was, have they been accurate in the past, or do we have to do a lot of course corrections as we go through? Like, is this a fairly accurate science, or is it a fairly inaccurate science?
Through the chair, it's a good question. It's an art and science together, so it's a craft. So what we found is the growth projections that were undertaken with the 2014 DC study haven't quite proved out. During the initial period, we were hit really hard by the Great Recession, as I think everyone knows. So there was a bit of a slowdown in single-family starts in particular that really impacted the amount of revenue that we had that we could then continue to maintain our capital program. We're pretty confident in the growth projections that have been provided, but we'll be continuing to monitor those as we go forward.
Neither an art nor a science, but a craft, as long as we're not considered crafty. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you, actually just picking up on Councillor Morgan's question, it just spurred something. Knowing that also we're subject to, and you'd mentioned about the recession, that we're subject to some market conditions as well that might be perhaps hyper-variable. We've talked about the increase in cost of steel, for example, if those tariffs were to go through. Is that something that can be contemplated in the 5-year growth projections, and what those costs might look like and how we can absorb that through this?
Through the chair, so that gets a bit to the art portion of things, where our consultants really doing a lot of modeling at a macroeconomic level, so looking at both global, national, and provincial economic factors that could impact us as well. They do provide their best knowledgeable projection on what they think growth will be. In terms of what's been happening in recent years, I'm not sure quite how that has been articulated through the projection. It's a little difficult to anticipate. But the important thing to remember is that we're doing a 20-year projection, so we're looking over a very long period. So that's why we use the GMIS in particular for the interim period as we go forward.
Follow.
Thank you very much. I've got a couple more questions along this. In one of your graphs, you showed how we compared to other municipalities over 100,000, and some of them are noted to be using area rating. I know, as we've had discussions previously, that we're not really pursuing area rating itself per se right now, but we'll be investigating over the course of the next 5 years how we might be able to parse that out. I'm curious how those other cities use area rating, and I guess in the context. I've got a couple more after that.
Through the chair, I actually have a slide in my reserve deck that sort of helps explain some of this a bit for everyone's benefit. So as Councillor Turner mentioned, the city does currently operate on an average rate approach. So what we do is we look at the growth costs for all developments in the city. We then take the total amount of the growth costs for all of those areas divided by the total amount of growth for those areas. An area rate approach would be looking at individual growth areas, the costs associated with those and the growth associated with those to do charges for those specific areas. We are continuing the recommendation that was before Council and Committee back in the spring, was to continue on with the average rate approach to DCs. We are going to be looking at the area rate approach as we go forward, which, as you mentioned, a number of municipalities have examined and have implemented. That's something that will extend beyond the 2019 DC study as we progress towards 2024.
Thanks. Yeah, I am kind of curious about their experience. I think that might be really helpful for us to know at some point, to know how, I guess, Hamilton, Markham, and Windsor from your slide have all implemented area rating to some degree. I'd be interested to know where they've placed it and how they're using it and what the effect has been. I think it's going to be one of the biggest tools that we can use to help manage our growth and focus our growth in the areas that we want it to be in most specifically. I want to ask specifically as well about some of our community improvement plans or development charge incentives. We have industrial, commercial, residential, institutional. We don't have, actually, we make contributions to our development charge reserves to the tune of about $8.3 million a year, I think. Knowing that those are incentives and end up being fees that we don't recover, that we end up paying on the levy. This is a question that's probably totally illegal, but I can ask it anyway. Can that $8.3 million be distributed through the remainder of the development charges and be recouped from those who are paying versus those areas where, and so it almost becomes an adjusted area rating in its own right?
Through the chair, so the Development Charges Act actually does preclude that from occurring. You do have to make sure that certain forms of development aren't subsidizing other forms as well. So when the city does pay for the DCs for an industrial building, for example, we're putting those individual DCs into the specific reserve funds to make sure that we're making ourselves whole as we go forward, based on what we assumed the growth was going to occur if the proponent were to pay it themselves.
Thank you. Councillor Hopkins, please. You'll get another turn if you need.
Thank you, and through the chair, I just want to thank staff for the presentation. Every time I think I know DCs, I draw a blank, so I can never know enough about how they work. There's always changes and different situations. I do really appreciate the handout that we've received on residential and the breakdown from single and semi-detached to multiple row housing and 2 bedrooms. And I've noticed there is a decrease in the row housing and the 2 bedrooms and an increase in residential. And if you can explain the difference?
Through the chair, so as the councillor did mention, we are looking at an increase for the single family rate, but a decrease for multiples that's being projected. The key driver for that is the persons per unit factor that actually occurs within those units. That's a key driver when we actually do our rate calculation. Our PPUs are actually lower than they were for the 2014 DC study, and as a result, that's reducing the rate for those as well. So that's why you're seeing the projected decreases.
And if I can I have a follow-up? There's 2 columns with apartments with 2 bedrooms. What is the difference between the 2?
Through the chair, so we actually have a separate charge for 1-bedroom apartments versus more than 1-bedroom apartments, recognizing that when you have more people in an area, they have generally more cost associated with them.
Thank you. Councillor Turner, did you have another question before I turn it to Mr. Lehman? Councillor Lehman.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through the chair, just a quick question. It reads, from a DC infrastructure servicing perspective, it is not anticipated that building conversions triggered by a change of use would have a material impact on municipal servicing requirements. If that's the case, why are there different charges depending on the category, like commercial, industrial, and institution?
Through the chair, so as I mentioned at the beginning, what we're doing is we're looking at the new growth that's occurring to determine what the servicing cost is associated with that new growth. So that's why we have individual charges for those IC, either industrial, commercial, and institutional. We're looking at what's the infrastructure cost associated with those. With the conversions matter, in our growth projections, we're actually netting out conversions, so they actually don't work into our determination of capital costs. We also have a very few number of conversions that we do a year, and even though they do have servicing costs that are implicit in it, we feel those are minor, and therefore we can provide the recommendation that's before you.
Any other questions for Mr. Young? Well, we're going to let you sit for a moment. We will be calling you back up in just a moment. We have had requests from 3 different parties for delegation status. And I'm at the pleasure of council if you wish to hear them now. The other option, I suppose, would be to wait until March for the public participation process. Those names are in your agenda. What's the pleasure of council? Councillor Hopkins?
Yes, I'd like to move that we hear the delegation.
Is there a seconder? Seconder Turner? Comments, questions, Mr. Van Meerbergen? Councillor Van Meerbergen? You were seconded? Any comments or questions with respect to that? All right, we'll turn your attention to the screen. And we're going to do all 3 at once. That's what we've decided to do, just to make that simple for all of us. And then we will if approved here from our delegations.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 14-0.
Well, there we have. So we have 3 delegations, and we have more than one individual in the first delegation, 1 in the second, 1 in the third. I would ask this, a maximum of 5 minutes per delegation, and remind you that because we also have the public participation process that takes place in March, that there may be, I'm not here to direct your comments or commentary, but you might have 1 or 2 things that are key things you want to say, all within the 5 minutes, but I'm at your pleasure. This won't be a Q&A unless there's a compelling question from council, but we'll start with the delegation from S11, A. Beaton, and A. Stratton. Would you identify yourself and please proceed, sir? Okay, can I ask you, as Mr. Veach, you're ready, so as the others are making their way down, perhaps, again, this would be from the London Development Institute. Mr. Veach, please, would you do a better introduction than I just did?
Absolutely, thank you, Your Worship. Yes, my name is Bill Veach. I'm with the London Development Institute, representing the London Development Institute. And I did get word from Lois Langdon from LHBA that she sends her regret for tonight, so I will probably speak a little bit on behalf of her as well. Not completely, but on behalf of LHBA. And Mr. Levin was just making his way downstairs. First of all, I just want to thank Council and staff for giving us the opportunity to work with them this last year or so. In fact, probably last 7 or 8 years, but this last year in particular for this particular review, this DC review. We have participated in pretty much every program they've had. I think they've said they've had 17 or 18 already this past year. And we find, as Mr. Yeoman has said, that it's been a very good discussion and interaction to be able to make sure that we have our say and our position at the table. So first of all, I just wanted to reiterate a couple things that Mr. Yeoman said. First of all, I just want to clarify that development industry, the commercial development, so as much as we may pay that rate up front, it is, at the end of the day, the homeowner, the new homeowner that has to pay that, and the new taxpayers, or the taxpayer that has to pay it. So we, number one, we endorse the principle of growth pays for growth, but number two, we want to make sure that whatever we come up with at the end of the day is affordable, and also keeps the City of London competitive in whatever rates we do come at. It does signify a fairly big part of the charge that would go as part of the purchase of a new home. At this point, you're about $33,000, like you said, is what you're talking about here. So we have had the opportunity to work through with staff on this at this point in time, and we believe that right now we've come a long ways right now. We're looking at this as a fairly modest increase this year is what is being proposed. We've gone through a second time round as far as what that particular cost will be in order to be able to provide the capital, in order to be able to do the works that need to be done in order to keep growing the City of London. So we're quite pleased that we've come to that point already. We do believe that over the next couple of months, we will have the opportunity to work with staff to find perhaps, hopefully, some more savings. We think there's still some opportunities to find some savings to keep these numbers as low as they possibly can and still give us that opportunity to provide growth to the city, the needed growth to the city for the next 5 years as well. So again, I want to thank Council and staff for the opportunity for London Development Institute and LHV to be involved with this process. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Veach. I appreciate that. We now have delegates S11, A. Beaton, and A. Stratton. Apologies for initials, Sandy, we know well, and some of us, and you can make your appropriate introductions. Again, 5 minutes for the complete introduction and comments. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. With me is Alistair Beaton. He's the other representative from the Urban League on the stakeholder group. For those of you who don't know the Urban League, we're an umbrella group whose members include neighborhood associations, community groups, and individuals from across London. We've been at the development charges table since the early 1990s, and we thank staff for continuing to have us at the table. Staff has spent significant hours with the stakeholder group, and as Mr. Veach had said, the stakeholder group works really well. And thanks to Mr. Hayward for the work he did in bringing the stakeholders together for the 2014 study and the continuation of staff of doing that work. DCs are hard. The legislation keeps changing. It's a complex subject. I keep learning new things, and I've been at this for a lot of years. It's not something you have in your household budget, but it pays for a significant part of road widenings, new sewers, new buses, et cetera. And as Mr. Veach said, all the stakeholders agree that growth should pay for growth. However, there are what keeps getting termed exemptions out there in the public. These are your community improvement plans for industrial development, downtown and Old East, multi-residential. But these are really subsidies. You can call them incentives. But the DC payment comes from the taxpayer, not from growth. That's a public policy decision that is with Council. And as mentioned by Mr. Yeoman in his presentation, there's also the statutory 10% that's tax supported for soft services, new libraries, recreation facilities, and the other soft services. And as Mr. Yeoman pointed out in his presentation, some London characteristics make it harder to compare our rate to other, let's say, apples and oranges. We've got a lot of road projects. Surrounding municipalities don't. In fact, already at this point in the study, $190 million of road projects have been deferred to keep the DC rate affordable. And you can certainly move more projects off into the future to reduce the DC, but that comes with either a congestion cost or you won't build a new trunk sewer, which means you won't have a subdivision over there. So as the teeter-totter moves, and as pointed out in the presentation by Mr. Yeoman, London has included stormwater management in the rate, and many other municipalities don't. Oh, and last but not least, this one always bugs me, is we talk about what happens if the rates aren't right and the growth doesn't materialize. Well, that's where growth management implementation comes in, because you don't want to put yourself in a position where you're borrowing money to pay debt on bonds you've already issued to pay for growth. And that's how we manage that growth management implementation strategy. So thank you again for the time to present, and look forward to other opportunities to talk about my favorite subject, development charges.
Thank you. And in the few moments left, will Mr. Beaton be making any comments? You said it all then.
No, but thank you, Your Honor, for the chance. Sammy said it very well.
Thank you. He always does. Thank you. All right, thank you very much, Mr. Yeoman. We're going to get you back up as we vote on this motion here. We're at 4.1. I think we've asked the various questions that we needed to ask of Mr. Turner. Councillor Turner, we knew we'd get you back. Please, Mr. Yeoman, if you would.
Your worship, you've managed to find an area I'm passionate about, if anybody can be passionate about development charges. I did have a couple questions for our presenters, if I may.
Actually, do you know what? It's not, I'm going to actually get some advice from council. I've been advised in the past that it's not the normal thing to do that, to extend their presentation time, but what's the pleasure? And without voting, I'd like to get a consensus. Is that and I'll blame my newness on this, but is that typical? Is that normal? Do we wait for the public participation process? Can you have a coffee or a beer later? I'd like to get some advice around this, please. Any thoughts as to how this has been done, Michael? Or Councillor Venn?
Well, I've seen it happen occasionally. I do think that one of our greatest assets is the passion of Londoners. Obviously, it's here, so I would allow the questions.
Any other thoughts quickly? Yes, Councillor Plaza. Well, it is Councillor Turner, so that is a thoughtful question. So if I could ask this, if you would like to, is it the pleasure of council to, then I need to, we could put this to a vote. Does anyone want to, I need a motion on this one way or the other then, please, to proceed. As to, Councillor Van Holst, what's your motion?
I'll move that we proceed with the questioning.
And is there a seconder? Councillor Cuyahoga. Anyone wants to speak to this motion? We are preparing a question. Yes, Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just through you, respectfully, since we limit the delegations to 5 minutes, I would request that we limit the question period to 5 minutes as well. I think we need to be respectful of folks' time.
And hopefully less. And I say that with all respect. Any other comments or questions? Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We generally, at committee, allow councillors to speak as often as they need to. This is the forum that we have established in order to get the information we need to make the decisions we need to make. And then we have a much more structured and formal process at the city council meeting. But that's the whole point of us meeting as a committee as a whole. Otherwise, these kinds of issues are broken down and they go to the standing committees. But when it's a topic that is of interest and concern to all of council and all of Londoners, we're pretty loose with the rules when we meet as committee.
So I'm not sure if that means yes or no, but we'll see how you vote. Councillor Squire.
Yeah, it hasn't been my experience that although councillors are allowed to speak as often as they want, it hasn't been my experience that we have interplay between a delegation and councillors. It happens sometimes. My concern, of course, is if we open this up, then if it becomes a new practice and somebody comes, makes a delegation, 6 or 7 councillors decide they want to ask questions, and we add hours to our meeting, and I just don't want to go down that road. And yes, I am a rules meister.
Councillor Hillier.
Question, will this delegation be available for the public participation meetings so the public can ask them questions?
Not my place to respond, but I would speculate that they would be, but I'm not going to get into a Q&A with them because that's what we're trying to determine now. But I'll speculate they know this process well and likely would. Councillor Hopkins. I'm sorry. Councillor Van Meerbergen.
Well, Mayor, I don't think we need a vote on this. You're in the big chair. It's your call. You decide.
Well, that's why I threw it over. Listen, I don't mind making a decision on this, but I would say to you, there seems to be, in the spirit of what seems to be more support to hear it from not, I would tell you my concern would be, as has been expressed, that this is a way to give delegations additional time, notwithstanding the thoughtful questions that any councillor might have of them. And if it were my decision solely, I would decline the request. Having said that, if it's a decision from the chair, I didn't think so because we have a motion on the floor. Maybe the next time we'll make a decision from the chair, but there's a legitimate motion on the floor. Yes, no, it's duly noted. So I can't go the other way when I've already gone one way. So, any other comments or questions? Is the question ready? Let's turn your attention to the screen, please.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 12-3.
Motion carried. Then the chair can put a limitation, I suppose. Let's make it 5 minutes Q&A max. And that's for any and all delegations, I presume, Mr. Turner. Councillor Turner, you have the floor. Which delegation would you like to hear from?
Thank you, Worship. I have 2 questions, one for Mr. Veach and one for Mr. Levin, which will take significantly less time than the amount of time we spent debating it. Mr. Leach, if I might, your question, in your letter you expressed some concerns about the water servicing addition. Could you expand on that a little bit more than what we have in the letter, please?
Yes, to you, Your Worship. Basically, over the last number of DCs, there was a number of studies that were done, a number of evaluations were done that took a look at the rate structure and looked at how the water system was being paid for through the water board and through the different rate structures. And what our concern is that it is our experience that any of the other municipalities and folks that pay into the water supply system through the water board have not in the past set up any DCs for recovery of water supply. We tried to take a look at how we can differentiate the development portion of the rate structure versus the non-development portion of the rate structure. And through that analysis that happened in the past, we found that there was not a really clear understanding between what could be charged as a development cost and what wouldn't be charged as development cost. The industry brought it forth through the last DCs and probably the previous one as well, that it's better to leave it under the rate structure, the water rate structure, for any of the studies and growth that might happen that might benefit all of the users of the system itself. What's happening in this particular one, even though it's just a very small component, it's the principle of how it's going to we want to make sure there's not any double counting there. That was the biggest part of it.
May I ask if any other councillor or any councillor has a question, another question for Mr. Veach before, because I believe you said you had two, both delegations you wanted to hear from. Any other questions for Mr. Veach? Seeing none, then Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Veach, for that, and I really appreciate your letter and spirit of collaboration. For Mr. Levin, specifically with you'd alluded to some discussion about kind of that teeter-totter, about playing with the rates a little bit. If the development charge rates itself on any of the categories were to be reduced, where would that be done, and what would be the impact?
Well, for example, if transportation being the largest component, something in the order of $700 million. If you reduce the number of projects, your capital cost goes down, and you still spread it over the same number of units, you'd have a lower charge, but you'd have a consequence. Consequence is you're not widening certain roads, you'd have higher congestion. Or if it was a trunk, let's pick one project, Adelaide Street Underpass. Not sure you want to change that one. But you can't move the rate without having a consequence if you're going to move the numerator of that arithmetic. You can play with the growth numbers, but as the question earlier from Councillor Morgan pointed out, forecast is a forecast. And traditionally for the 4 or 5 studies I've been at the table, we've overestimated the demand. We've overestimated the number of units. So there's no easy way to do it. Mr. Veach had talked about something like the piece on the water supply. That's $6. If you're looking at affordability of the development charge, staff have already, at the stakeholder group, taken out $189 million of road projects. That's your impacts.
I just remind you there's 1 minute left, so I just did not want to be rude and interrupt twice.
I'm fine. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Your comments or questions for Mr. Levin? Well, thank you very much as well. I appreciate that kindly. Thank you. And I'd like to remind council that while we were reminded that the delegation debate took several minutes and longer than the allotment of our delegates' Q&A with council, I'd like to suggest that democracy is sometimes bumpy, but we usually get to the right place. So thank you all for your understanding on that. Mr. Yeoman, can we get you back up, please? Because we are now going to vote. We have the vote on 4.1.
No, we have to do the main motion.
Back to the main, well, excuse me, back to the main motion. Thank you. And Mr. Hillier, can I turn to you, please, for the main motion? You can read it if you like. Yeah, just so it's clear that everybody knows what they're voting. That's why we're doing this, to make it clear. Thank you. Would you like the clerk to read it just to make it easier? I know you know it's there. Clerk.
That on the recommendation of the Managing Director, Development and Compliance Services and Chief Building Official, with the concurrence of the Managing Director, Corporate Services and City Treasurer, Chief Financial Officer, the 2019 Development Charges Study Update on Draft Rates Report be received for information.
Moved by Councillor Hillier, sir. Seconder? Councillor Sally. Any other comments or questions? May I turn your attention to the screen, please?
Closing the vote, the motion carries 15-0.
And thank you, Mr. Newman, for your presentation and for our delegations for their commentary. That's helpful. 4.2 is the 2019 development charges study. It's the non-residential rate review. What we're discussing here are development charges at 100 Kellogg Lane. And Mr. Newman, would you be available for any Q&A? I know that certainly one councillor has some questions on that. If we could now entertain first any questions with respect to this issue. Councillor Morgan.
Yes, my question isn't related to Kellogg's Lane. It's related to the general non-residential rate review. So, Mr. Yeoman, in your presentation, I appreciate the very nice graph with the blue square and the green square that outlined how this would work. In the report, you talk about there not necessarily being any sort of material impact on municipal service requirements. However, I would have some level of concern about someone bringing forward an industrial development, which maybe would get a subsidy through a CIP, then looking to convert to commercial for free, essentially, if it's the same square footage. So will there be a mechanism like a phase-in or a cap on if you get a subsidy, how long it can be until you can actually convert to commercial to mitigate that in some way? Because I think that would be certainly a risk with this approach if there wasn't a mechanism to protect against it.
Through the chair, that's definitely something that'll be in the draft bylaw that'll be before you. Really, we're trying to avoid what we term DC beaters, which are people that will go and avail of the industrial incentive to build an industrial building and then outfit that right away to commercial units as they go forward. What we'll have is a provision that we currently have in our bylaw that states that you can only avail of that recommended conversion approach if the building is more than 10 years old. So council's making sure it gets a very good return on its investment in the industrial incentive.
Follow-up?
Yes, so thank you for that. I'm very glad to hear that because I think that would be certainly the only concern I would have, given that that's how we're going to continue on with the phase-in. I think that this is probably a very reasonable approach. I know that certainly there have been some examples in my ward where this has been a challenge of, an industrial zone that is converting to a little bit more of a commercial feel, whether that's for gyms or other things where old industrial buildings convert into things that have a great benefit to the community. So I like the approach, and I think it's fair to recognize, and so I'll certainly be supporting the motion before us.
Thank you, Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, and thank you, Councillor Morgan. Great questions. I think it's important that we understand the process and making sure that that we're looking at everything. I am curious. I have no problem supporting this. Just curious on what the exemption amount is.
So the amount would, through the chair, the amount would vary based on whatever building would be proposed. The actual amount would be zero based on the calculation. So depending, as long as I mentioned, it's a 1-to-1. So if you're going and converting a similar size building to a similar size building, you wouldn't be paying development charges for the space that exists on the ground today at the adoption of the bylaw.
Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to Mr. Yeoman. I think this is great. I'm really excited to see this will really promote adaptive reuse of a lot of the buildings within the city, and I think that's a great policy move. The question I had is, in certain circumstances, I'm possibly foreseeing a situation where one use converts to another use that may require some significant upgrade of infrastructure to support that, where the development charges would normally be the contributor to those infrastructure works in order to support it. It would no longer be recouped from that. I can't think of a specific example, maybe something that just uses a ton of water or something like that as it moves in. But is there a mechanism that we could put in place to address something like that?
Through the chair, that's not something that we really can prepare for with the recommendation. As I mentioned, that key clause in Section 5 of the Act, we don't calculate DCs on the specific servicing needs of an individual project, so we do the average approach that we have. That's something, with this approach that's recommended before you, we're going to continue to monitor it over the next 5 years if Council does endorse it and adopt it, look if there are situations like that and whether or not there is grounds to change on our approach.
Councillor Helmer.
Thank you, and certainly I'd be willing to move the recommendation that the charges be maintained with the three-part rate structure, that the conversions be exempt, that be what we consider in the 2019 DC bylaw, and that the background study incorporate those clauses. I think, just speaking briefly to Part B, we've had several people before us at various points. I've got Councillor Morgan, of course, bringing up the ones that were in his ward, and then we think back to the Junction Climbing Center, which came before the previous council, and then also before us at Corporate Services, saying, you know, this is not working for us. We're trying to repurpose this building, and we're getting hit with the development charges. And of course, with the existing DC bylaw, that's the way it is, and you have to pay the DC bylaw charges. I think we see a really big example of it with the letter that we have here from the folks who are redeveloping Kellogg's, which is 1 million square feet. You know, they're trying to keep the existing building, repurpose it to all kinds of different uses. And I think we run into it in a very large scale there. And so it comes in smaller pieces, which obviously are significant for the proponents of those particular projects. But then when it gets added up into one big project, we can see it writ large. And for, you know, the general idea of we want to go inward and upward, we want to reuse existing buildings instead of building new stuff on the edge of town, and only doing that. And right now we have the kind of odd situation where we're discouraging adaptive reuse through the approach in the DC bylaw and encouraging it with incentives on the industrial side. So say build the new industrial building on the edge, you can have a discount on the DC. Or if you want to convert something in the middle, you got to pay full freight to convert it to a commercial. So I think that is a weird situation, and I'm glad that we worked through it. I wasn't sure what the best approach was going to be, one uniform rate, or to say, okay, we're going to keep this three-part rate structure and look at an exemption for the conversions when you're not changing the square footage of the building and you're just changing the use. So I think this is a good way forward. I think it needs to be fair for everybody. You know, can't make these one-off changes for different people. We have to change the bylaw and make it comprehensive. I look forward to seeing what people's feedback are when we get to the actual bylaw itself, but I think at this point I'm willing to endorse this direction.
We have that was a moving commentary, and we have Councillor Lewis in seconding. Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, may I turn your attention to the screen, please.
Closing the vote, that motion carries 15-0.
Thank you very much. Now we'll turn your attention to 4.3, the confirmation of appointments to the Hyde Park. Oh, thank you, Mr. Yeomans. Pardon me. Confirmation of appointments to the Hyde Park Business Improvement Association. I'll note we've received correspondence from the Hyde Park BIA, and the names following are that they have put forward: Nancy Moffett Quinn, Christine Buchanan, Terry Ann Daniel, Lorianne Pritchard, Tom Delaney, and Mandy Hurst. So I am looking for a motion to accept. Councillor Morgan, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. Any comments or questions? Turn your attention to the screen, please.
Closing the vote, that motion carries 15-0.
Thank you. 4.4, consideration of appointments to the Plumbers and Drain Layers Examining Board. You'll recall, by the way, when we went through our process of appointments and all, there were somewhere we were looking for some feedback from various interested parties, and that's what we're dealing with now. It requires 2 members. 2 names have been put forward: D. Brower and M. Salas. Is there a mover? Councillor Turner, is there a seconder? Councillor Van Meerbergen. Any comments or questions? Councillor Pelosi.
Thank you, Your Worship. At the last meeting, I believe we had already appointed an S. Atchison to the board. Just wondering what happened to their application, if they withdrew it or are unable to fulfill that.
Clerk.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, these are two additional ones. We needed 3 and we only had 1 application, so we went out and sought some additional applications.
Thank you. Any other questions? May I turn your attention to the screen, please?
Closing the vote, the motion carries 15-0.
Thank you. Turn your attention to 4.5, consideration of appointment to the Committee of Revision, Court of Revision, requiring 1 member. Kay May's name has been put forward. Is there a mover? Councillor Van Holst. Is there a seconder? Councillor Morgan. Excuse me, Van Morgan. Versus Van Meerbergen versus Van Pelosi. That's how it all works. All right. Any comments or questions? It's getting interesting. Any comments or questions? Yes, Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to the clerk, I guess. I just want to confirm, because the attachment that we received in our agenda, the applicant was referencing his interest in the libraries. And I don't know if the applicant perhaps applied to multiple positions and we just got the wrong one, or what the situation was there.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, this is another one where we didn't have sufficient a number of applications, and I was directed to go out, and so we reached out to a number of applicants and asked if they were interested, and this individual said they would be happy to put their name forward for this.
Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Turn your attention to the screen, please.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 15-0.
Thank you very much. I'll turn your attention to 4.6, the results of the ranked ballot for the London Transit Commission requiring 3 members. We directed the clerk to go back and review those numbers and names, and the results are T. Park, S. Ruth, and T. Khan, but that will require a motion from council to accept. Councillor Turner, a seconder. Councillor Kayabaga, any comments or questions? Councillor Morgan.
Yes, through you, Your Worship. I want to make a couple of comments on this this item, including the reference to ranked ballots in the agenda. I have some frustration with what we've done here over a period of time. And it stems from a former city councillor writing all of us saying that they're trying to link this ranked ballot process to the election process, which is completely untrue. They're completely unrelated. In the elections process, we have a set of regulations that the province established, and then designed an algorithm and a process to actually go through and do that. That's not what we've done here. This is a series of actions that have been taken and have changed a process that was meant to move beyond the old system of appointments into something that was better. The old system was basically a race to whoever nominated first, because everybody was afraid to vote against a candidate when they were on the floor, and we wanted to move towards more of a preferential system. And so at committee, we established basically a ranked ballot, but the intent of that ranked ballot was really to show people's preferences, and then we would have a debate on those individuals, at which point things like the needs of the organization could come into play, whether they need a lawyer or they need someone with HR experience or that sort of thing. And so you may not necessarily use the ranked ballot, but it seems now this has evolved into pretty much an election for committee positions. And I don't think that does a service to the committees that we're trying to appoint to. So, this would be the point where colleagues, if they want to debate what the output has been and they want to discuss it, that is very appropriate. That was what was always intended through the process. And quite frankly, I think that's why this isn't working. And I would say this is one you might want to debate, because the way that we've done this and because we've allowed for nobody to rank and because we allowed rankings to stay very high, we have situations in this particular ballot where you have someone who had 6 number ones and 2 number twos and doesn't end up winning because they had 5 people who didn't rank them, thus put them at a 26-point disadvantage because everybody else only had 3 who didn't rank them. So this is the point where you don't have to accept exactly what was done. You could actually debate the merits of the candidates, and then you can actually pass a resolution. For every vote that we've taken, it hasn't been an election. We've always passed a resolution after the vote and then made a decision. I'm not saying that the people who rank the top 3 aren't necessarily the best. I'm simply commenting on the process because it's been very frustrating to engage with dialogue in the community on something that is causing some confusion. And I think we really need to go back to, if we want to continue to use this through the governance working group, establish a set of regulations that we want to follow and then establish a process that follows them, because this ad hoc process has been pieced together and it's creating a lot of issues and confusion, and we need to move beyond that. So I wanted to point that out for our colleagues, that this is not an election. You can actually debate these things if you feel you need to.
Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you, Your Worship. I also wanted to point out something of interest here is that our system really is 2 things combined in one. We have a point system whereby we're ranking the candidates, and then we have an elimination process. And the elimination process really only has meaning if you're trying to get down to one person to the point where they have a majority of first votes. That was the purpose of the elimination. If we're not trying to get to one person or show one person has the majority, then really we could just look to our point system. And on this one on page 40, if you see the bottom 3 people, you can just look to see who's got the fewest number of points. And that's probably the easiest and most legitimate way to look at this as an election of a number of people. So in that case, you would see T. Con, J. Fife Miller, and S.L. Ruth as the top 3, which might be more consistent than trying to do a partial elimination.
If I might add in terms of this, what I find when I have been involved in board appointments in the past, we did needs analysis. We tried to determine what a board needed to be able to progress, what skill sets, what experience, and what the value proposition that they provided for a board. I felt that somewhat wanting in this process this time. And so whether we agree or disagree on the way that we got to the people that we got to, and I'm not disparaging any of them, my practical concern would be the issue around the needs analysis of boards, what the strengths are that they need to promote the best interests of the city. That would be my broad comment. Any other comments with respect to this process? Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Your Worship. And I just want to echo Councillor Morgan and Councillor Van Holsten, and frankly your own comments. I agree with what all 3 of you have said in this process. Certainly when I was ranking my ballots at that prior SPPC meeting, when we were told we didn't have to rank the ballots, I was not under the impression that by not ranking, I was going to be doubly penalizing somebody from not ranking them. I was under the understanding that their points would drop each round as the number of candidates decreased. So I feel like my votes were not fully informed based on the information I was given. I think we do need to clean this up before this happens again.
Councillor Hopkins.
Yes, and thank you to my colleagues. I think you all make valid comments, and I'm glad that this is going to the governance working group where they can look at it. But in the meantime, I do think rank balloting, we have used it in the previous council. We've changed it a little bit, and so we always ranked, but we always had a shorter list. It's very difficult to rank 12 people 1 to 12. It's a lot easier if you shorten your list. We did that at the previous council, and then we made sure we ranked. So I think there was a little bit of confusion on how to do it, what was done in the past. I'm really glad that it's going to go to the working group for review.
Any other comments or questions from council? Councillor Hillier.
To call this rank balloting, I think is incorrect. In no other process would you ever give someone a rank ballot and the penalty would be carried through the ranking system almost to a factor of 4 to 1 by the end. I don't see we can call this rank balloting, and we need to reconsider how we're doing this process. And I'm not sure if going to the working group is fast enough for what we need for this term.
Well, any other thoughts or comments around that? Councillor Elmer.
I'm certainly open to talking about how we're going to do the appointments in the future. I think there's lots of room for improvement for the overall process. You know, I think it's appropriate that we referred it to governance working group. We've made a number of appointments using this process already. A bunch of those have already been passed by council. I don't think that there's any huge problem that needs to be fixed with the appointments to Tourism London or the London Transit Commission in terms of the process that we use. It's the same process we use for all the other appointments. I think that it is not a time-saving thing to have a rank ballot where we get everyone's preferences on these candidates, do all the tallying, and then potentially debate all of those things individually again after we see what the preferences are. You know, there were lots of situations where people who I did not rank very highly were appointed to these different organizations. That's fine. You know, this is the sort of overall preference of the council. That's what we're trying to figure out. And I think it's much better than the way we used to do it, which was, had a lot of very significant weaknesses, which Councillor Morgan mentioned. So, you know, I would caution people that, you know, the fact that you don't like this particular constellation of people, we did this on a number of things, right? We use the exact same process. I think we should use the same process for all these things. If we want to change that process, we can change it. I think there's room for improvement. I do think that, you know, the number of instances where people are nominated and then not ranked first by anyone, right? That tells me that we're probably nominating too many people, right? So I think we're going to have to say, if you're going to nominate someone, is this someone you're going to rank first? Because I don't know that that's a great idea to have so many people up for so few positions. It makes the rank balloting take a really long time, and a lot of people who don't really have much of a chance of being selected are being put through this whole process. So, you know, I think I would agree with the general idea that we could change it. I would be a little reluctant to change it right now for just this one.
Councillor Squire.
You know, I wasn't going to speak, but I have to. I think people are I think the arguments that are being made on the are really on the basis of results and how people feel about the results and what they think about the people who have gone on to these committees. And I don't want to pull any punches on that. I think that's exactly what happened. And the real difficulty I have is people are saying, well, you know, the process worked pretty good. You know, maybe you didn't get the people you wanted. I think some people knew exactly what they were doing when they voted on these ranked ballots, and I think some people didn't know and voted in a way that was very different than they would have. And I have no doubt, based on what Councillor Van Holst is saying, that the result would have been different, and I think that's troublesome. But the thing that's truly troublesome is to have people saying, well, you know, we should accept the result. Okay, so we're going to accept the result, but we're going to do those interviews. We're going to do those interviews. So what is the purpose of the interviews other than to change an electoral result? There's no other reason. So it's hard for me to sit here and listen to a lot of noble reasons being given when I just don't believe that and I don't feel that. I think some people got what they wanted, and I think some people didn't, and it depends which side you come down on.
Any other comments or questions before I call the question? May I turn your attention to the screen, please? We are confirming acceptance of the 3 on this ballot.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 11-4.
Thank you very much. I'll turn your attention to 4.7, the Tourism London Board of Directors requiring 2 council members. There's been the results in front of you. Councillors Lewis and Kayabaga have been ranked as our representatives for Tourism London. And I think I'll ask for a mover and a seconder, and I'll call for discussion. Is there a mover, Councillor Van Holst? Is there a seconder, Councillor Lehman? Any comments or discussion? Councillor Morgan.
Yeah, just briefly now, aside from what I just said, this is a fully ranked ballot, which really shows you preferences. And the preferences that are shown here are that there's all three of our colleagues are felt to be very capable. The difference between the second and third was 1 point on the first ballot. That really says that Council had a lot of confidence in both to serve on this committee, and I appreciate that a motion's been made, and I think we couldn't have really done wrong on this one, given the people who were put on it, and I think that the ballot actually shows that.
Yeah, I add a kudos to Councillor Van Holst. That showed a lot of class. Any other comments or questions? May I turn your attention to the screen, please?
Closing the vote, the motion carries 15-0.
Councillors, I'll turn your attention to a letter that we have from Councillors Pelosa and Hillier on December 14th with respect to the appointments as alternate member of the Lake Huron Primary Water Supply System Joint Board of Management, also the Middlesex London Food Policy Council and Kettle Creek Conservation Authority. If it's your pleasure, I'll reread it, but I don't think we need to do that. I'll presume that you all have. But let me just go through the following recommendations here, just so it's clear. The resignation of Councillor Pelosa from the Lake Huron Primary Water Supply System Joint Board of Management as an alternate member for the term December 1, 2018 to November 15, 22 be approved. And I'll just read the other three, I think, because they're all really concurrent. The resignation of Councillor Pelosa from the Middlesex London Food Policy Council for the term December 1, 2018 to November 30, 2020. The resignation of Councillor Hillier from the Kettle Creek Conservation Authority for the term December 1, 2018 to November 15, 2022. And Councillor Pelosa be appointed to the Kettle Creek Conservation Authority for the term December 1, 2018 to November 15, 2022. So you should all have that correspondence in front of you. Is there a mover? Councillor, no, do you know what I thought about? I think it's a bit of a conflict if we ask Councillors Pelosa or Hillier to move or second. I just feel it's nicer if you all do it instead.
Let's leave them on.
Councillor Sally, seconded by Councillor Lewis. It was a nice long letter, I have to say. Any comments or questions to that very thoughtful long letter? Councillor Hopkins.
Yes, Mr. Chairs, I have no problem supporting this, but want to make sure that we have appointments to the Lake Huron Board and to the London Food Policy Board. Are they taken care of?
They are not taken care of as yet. A council member would have to come forward to fill those vacancies. We've just dealt with basically the term around Kettle Creek. And we could do that under separate motion if that's appropriate. If there's interest from members to do that now, we can. But we have a motion on the floor. Any other comments or questions? I'll turn your attention to the screen, please.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 15-0.
So I'd like to take chairman's privilege and deal with the issues brought up by Councillor Hopkins, and that is that we're looking for an alternate member from council to take Councillor Pelosa's place from the Lake Huron Primary Water Supply System Joint Board of Management. Is there a member that would like to have their name put forward?
Are the meetings in Grand Bend?
I can't tell you where the meetings are. I suspect not. I suspect not. But we could have some good. opportunities in Sarnia, where I have a little cottage. Is there an individual from council, or we will direct the clerk to quietly solicit you? But but this is important, and if you're willing to put your name forward. Then I'll refer that to the clerk to gently strong arm you. The other is the Middlesex London Food Policy Council. Is there a volunteer from the board? Councillor Pelosi, when you took on these roles, you were the most popular councillor around the table, I think. Councillor Lewis, you would like to do that?
It's a 2-year term, sorry. That's a sales pitch for it, just 2 years.
Well, he's already said yes, don't buy it back.
Thank you, Your Worship. Food security is certainly an important issue in my ward, and with that in mind, I'll stand.
For all of us that eat well, that would be an appropriate term. Is there a mover for Councillor Lewis to have that role? Councillor Hillier, is there a seconder? You can second this one if you like. Councillor Pelosi, good thought. Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, may I turn your attention to the screen with respect to the Middlesex London Food Policy Council appointment. And as that is being typed up, I would ask you to reconsider, so we can deal with this tonight, the Lake Huron Primary Water Supply alternate member. So please consider that.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 15-0.
Thank you, Councillor Lewis. Do we have a volunteer? I feel like we're at an auction, you know. The auctioneer is now asking to go back on one item here, which is the Lake Huron Primary Water Supply System, and it comes with a free pass to my cottage. Pardon me? And it's only an alternate, I've been advised. Only, but it's especially an alternate is what I would have said. Ignore the clerk on that. Is there someone willing to take on that role? Clerk, I will direct you then, please, to find that person. I will direct you to find that individual, please, and provide some information back, please. I know you would never want to embarrass anybody publicly. That would be not like you. All right, thank you. So we will just defer that to the clerk. We have a confidential issue to be discussed, labor relations, employee negotiations. I'll read what it is under 6.1. It's a matter pertaining to labor relations and employee negotiations, advice or recommendations of officers and employees of the corporation, including communications necessary for that purpose and the purpose of providing instructions and directions to officers and employees of the corporation as it pertains to the 2019 proposed budget. Do I have a motion to move in camera? Councillor Kayabaga, seconded by Councillor Van Meerbergen. Turn your attention to the screen, please. Can we do that? Yeah. Over there or here? Yeah. We're going to adjourn from in camera, folks. Thank you. And before we vote, this is our chance to say to staff, thanks very much. I know it's been an important meeting that we've covered off. Appreciate you being here, and for those in the stands, all 2 of you now. But thank you very much for hanging in with us, and Daryl.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 15-0.
And Megan back there, sorry. We are now going in camera. Thank you.
And Daryl.
I said Daryl.